All right, before we start into the new unit, which is all about statistics, we're going to kind of review what you've probably been working with since elementary school, and that's the type of data graphs. So if we look at the first type of graph, you've seen this type of graph before, and if we just examine, for instance, what this graph is talking about, it talks about distribution of wait time at registration. Along the x-axis, we're talking about the waiting time, and here the number of users. Okay, so this type of graph, sometimes we call it a bar graph, but more commonly we're going to call it a histogram. There's a slight difference between a bar graph and a histogram. Now, when we look at something like this, you maybe remember doing a tally table, and you put the number of users, in this case between 0 and 30 minutes that they had to wait, and you ticked off, and the same thing for each of the other categories. And then you drew a bar graph type item. Now, when we're looking at something like this, one of the things that it's really good for is it very quickly and easily, it will tell us what we call the highest or the mode and the lowest frequencies. Very quickly, I can see that this blue is the highest. So most people spend between 61 and 90 minutes in waiting. Okay, another thing that it's really good for is range. Okay, so from the lowest to the highest. So very quickly, when we're talking about types of graphs, we're interested in looking at something and very quickly being able to see a certain type of information. So for a histogram, very quickly I can see that this is the highest, this is the mode, and I can also see that this is the lowest as far as wait times go, very, very quickly. The next type of graph that you have dealt with before is this circle graph. Now, some of these graphs, it's not just in math, you maybe have used them in science, geography, another wonderful place where you see these types of graphs. So obviously this is a circle graph or a pie graph, as we call them. And one thing that's very good for this type of graph is if I want to compare a population. So if I look at this graph is actually looking at the types of blood types, and it looked at 200 people. And from that 200 people, 40% had type O. We have almost 20% type AB, 25% type R, and 16% type A. So very, very good at comparing a population. Another thing that you can do with a pie graph is you actually can calculate the actual numbers in a category. So for instance, if I look at this one, we can see that how many people in this group have blood type AB. Well, if I look at blood type AB is here, and I know there were 200 people. So how do I figure out of those 200 people, how many of them had type AB? Well, it's actually quite easy. The first thing we would do is we would change the 19% to a decimal. So that would be 0.19. And all I do is I multiply that by the 200. So if I do that here, and just hold on a second, and then we take out our calculator, and we end up with 38. So we would expect that out of 200 people, 38 of them would have type AB blood. And we could do the same for the other ones if we really wanted to do that. Okay, so a pie graph, very good at comparing a population. So in other words, comparing a whole. The last type of graph that we're going to look at is this type of graph. Now you've worked with this already, and we know that this is called a scatter plot. And one nice thing about a scatter plot is we can first of all determine if a correlation exists. Now correlation is, if you notice the word relation, Sometimes you can find a relationship between variables. Okay, in this case, the variables are the number of hours you study and to see if there's a relationship between the test scores that someone receives. So that's what we need to look at, especially a lot in this unit, is if actually there is a relationship between two variables, in this case, studying time and your test score. Now, when we're doing this as well, what we're looking at is determining a line of best fit. Okay, I don't not quite sure where the line of best fit would be for this one, but I can see that is actually going up, so I know that it's at least going to be positive correlation. Whether it will be um, a quadratic or linear, we're going to assume that it's linear, maybe. But we can see the high score we can get is 100. So that's something that we will examine a little bit later on. Now, when we're talking about a line of best fit, what we want to look at is the types of slopes. Now, again, you've been working with these, so it's not a big surprise. Remember, when we're reading graphs, we're reading them from left to right. So if I put my screen on, it would be, I'm interested in this line that's starting here, this little purple line, and as I go, is it going up or down? Well, you can see this one's going up, so we would say that it's increasing, and in other words, it has a positive slope. And again, when this one starts over here, again, we're watching the purple line. What's its trend? It is actually decreasing, so it has a negative slope. So we have a positive slope and we have a negative slope. So this one is positive, and then we have this one as being negative. Again, very much a review of what you already should know. Now, we're going to look at calculating slope and then equation of the graph. So if I'm looking at calculating slope, remember slope is rise over run, or so slope we often use m. So it's rise over run. The other terminology that we've used with slope has been, delta y over delta x. So both of those you've seen before. So I can see that I'm touching it here and it's crossing the grid again at this location. So if I make my triangle, I can see that I have one square here and I have two here. Now you can see that this line has a negative slope. So I'm actually falling one. So I'm going to put -1 and I am running 2. So my slope here is -1/2. Now, if I want to go further here and actually look at making an equation of this particular line, we know that we have the slope stands for m, so we would put that into here. We would leave our y and our x, but then I have to look at the b. Now, you know from grade 9 and 10 for sure that that b is your initial spot or it is your y-intercept. You could also call it the initial or starting. So when we look at this particular equation, you can see that it is crossing the y-axis. So I'm interested in the y. So I take my eye, look at the y, go down, see where it crosses. Here it's crossing at 2. So that means my b is 2. So I'm going to go a +2. And I can finish my equation because we have already calculated the slope. So -1/2 x +2. So there's the equation of the graph. So what you're going to be doing now is just doing some review questions. It shouldn't take you very long, and you probably could start the next lesson. Okay, have lots of fun.